In the interest of time, I'll try to be as systematic as I can. Our method, as Mark has already started on, is we look at elements of both crisis and uneven austerity. One of the things that the way we understand austerity is as far-reaching as it is in the current context, it is an uneven project. As a geographer, it's a matter of faith, almost like the Holy Trinity, that capitalism is geographically and sectorally uneven. That it has to be. It's inherent in its development because capital always has to produce uneven landscapes so it can find its spatial fixes, etc. And uneven in the austerity programs we're seeing will not affect everyone equally. They'll be uneven across cities, nations, and regions of the world. And then, of course, as we do the different, we think that each of these current elements of austerity, as uneven as they may be, actually reinforce and feed into and are reinforced by different aspects, fairly accepted aspects of populism, and they have implications not only for labor, but they also provide strategic alternatives and opportunities and hints of what labor may do to gain leverage in the economy. And to start where Mark left off, we talked a little bit about producerism as an aspect of populism, that people have to produce something, and of course there's the lazy public sector workers part of that, and that feeds into scapegoating as well. Conspiracism, that the finance state collusion is active, and those austerity measures are really just to do nothing but to support the bailouts and stimulus spending. And of course that needs to really reorganize public workers to fight that powerful narrative. And then we get into other aspects of the austerity measures, which is the environment and the apocalypse. Climate change was really sexy 15 minutes ago, and now we hear nothing about it. The current Conservative federal government has abandoned it. Provincially, the Green Energy Act, which is probably the best thing going in Ontario, at least one of the top 2 provinces, has largely been discredited and attacked by the right. And of course, we have some momentum on green jobs in Toronto, but that's also been replaced by any jobs. But still reminding for much of the left, there is an apocalyptic narrative that climate change must be addressed and that capitalism will lead to its own destruction as the environment it's dependent upon declines. But there's always going to be tension between climate change as a means of disciplining labor, making sure transit workers get back to work so that air quality is maintained, versus a triple E vision of development that includes employment, gains, equity among workers, and the environment. Then another aspect that I think is really interesting is the cult of leadership, which is always inherent in a lot of populism. But the left, and especially the left labor movement, has abandoned. We have Naomi Klein, we have Roger Moore, but we haven't had a real adornation of the left leadership. Some people will date back to the Rooters in the CAW, and I think in the Canadian context, we haven't had a cult of leadership since the retirement of Bob White. So that's largely been left behind. And that creates a challenge. For some people that's all right, because there's always attacks on traditional centralized power and leadership models. But it does create sometimes a vacuum of power. And diffused power is always, that tension still remains. Then of course we talked a lot about this morning, Greg dealt with this quite clearly and quite effectively, is the idea of authoritarianism. And authoritarianism is inherent in populist movements. It's a surrender and trying to achieve order. And that kind of how it happens on the left and the right. And we see that with the security state, the loss of right to collective bargaining, the limits to protest in public. The rise of back to work legislation, of course, is, in the disciplining of dissent, is immediately has implications for labor. But there's a flip side to it too. Some really hard questions is how does labor then reach out to organize and get strength through the security apparatuses of society? So do we start organizing security guards? Or, in a real controversial, do we have to reach out and start organizing police? Police budgets in Canada have doubled in the last decade. Now, our position is no. We think that the police have no place at all in a modern contemporary labor movement with any integrity. That the state apparatuses and police security has to be left out, but we do have some more flexibility when it comes to mobilization of private security, especially security guards. And then lastly, of course, there's nativism, which has elements of left and right populism. It's important to both. We see it as anti-migration sentiment in the worst case scenario, and that's in Europe. where political parties are actually coming to power on this mandate. We see it in Canada with the disciplining of migrant labor and the restriction of status, okay, the othering of workers. And we see it again with the rise of protectionism, local procurement strategies in the US and Canada. That's another form of nativism. And there's of course all kinds of contradictions between the rise of migration and decline of status, and what kind of alliances that the left has to make with migrant groups to fight against this kind of racism. Now, all of these have huge implications for labor. And I'll just sum up with a couple of things that we've come to. And if the slide was too busy, we have handouts for the slides that you can come and get me. I have some later. But we do think that if you look at this nexus about where the intersections between populism, austerity measures, and the existing challenges and capacities of the current labor movement exist, that you do lead to some obvious points of maybe where there's bright spots. We've talked already about the potential for maybe organizing security workers, and the steel workers have in fact aggressively pursued this growing sector of employment. How about low-wage financial workers? And the question we asked in our paper that was published in the Bullet is, what happens if collection agency workers were unionized and went on strike? What does that do to the debt finance consumption patterns that the economy is dependent upon? The organizing of green workplaces, and this is a really important distinction that we make. We don't believe in a green jobs discourse. We don't believe green jobs exist. We think that you have to shift that conversation towards the greening of all work. And that's really important, because that's what's going to take to fight climate change. And of course, there needs to be a populist reorganizing of the public sector. It can't just be as the expert driven. It's got beyond simple community alliances and formation. There has to be a populist renewal of respect for public sector workers. And of course, all this might take new working class formations. And we talked about Occupy as one, and I'm not going to talk too much about it because there's been a lot of ink dedicated to Occupy over the last 12 months. Workers' assemblies are another way, I think, of entering into this nexus and reestablishing populist strategies. With that, elements for blue-green alliances or red-green alliances, which might even be better, and including the environment in these strategies. And then there's the dark side, and this is what we sort of, to bring everybody down. Why it's important is that there's also, we think, potential, and we say potential not in a good sense, but it's a potential as a possibility, for the rise of economic determinist militancy and the rise of right-wing unionism. And here, one of the case studies we're looking at now is CLAC. Does anyone here not know what CLAC is? Put up your hand. The Christian Labour Association of Canada. Okay. And one of the fastest growing labor unions in Canada, raiding construction sectors, especially in the West. This is the kind of populist right-wing unionism that could fill the void. And that's something that, sorry, I don't want to leave you on a bad note, but I'll end it there. Thank you.